Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the second series of Bats in Churches Live. So these webinars are hosted by the Bats in Churches project, and this is a unique collaboration between Natural England, Church of England, Bat Conservation Trust, Churches Conservation Trust, and Historic England. So the purpose of the project is to find solutions for churches struggling with roosting bats, to help the church community, conserve the heritage within the church, and to protect the bat roost. So I just want to say quickly before we begin, thank you very much to the National Lottery Heritage Fund and for those playing the National Lottery who make the project possible, as well as the British Ecological Society, who have funded a number of events throughout the year, like this one. So today we are very lucky to be joined by a guest chair, the Venerable Dave Middlebrook, Archdeacon of Bedford. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to him for this session about untangling the myths, the truth from the myths about bats and disease. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Claire, and a warm welcome to everybody. Lovely to see you today and in for a very interesting hour or so. My name's Dave Middlebrook. I'm Archdeacon of Bedford. That's in St Albans Diocese. My area covers some urban areas like Luton and Bedford, but also lots of rural areas. A number of those churches do have roosting bats, and some are part of the Bat Project. So I know firsthand the sort of a balancing act that we play between these beautiful buildings we have, the purpose which is a worship and mission, but also the challenges of the conservation of these wonderful mammals as well. There are often concerns about the droppings and the urine and those sort of issues that can be faced, and that may be putting people off attending church. But also we're aware that there's been a link between COVID-19 and bats, and part of today to try and dispel some of those inaccuracies and myths around that. There's an opportunity for you to ask questions, some of which have been put forward in advance, but there's a Q&A box at the bottom. Please do put your questions in if you'd like to. And we're very fortunate that we've got a number of experts with us today. So we're going to have a series of short talks, 3 short talks with time for questions at the end. And also I'm delighted therefore to introduce our first speaker. That's Lisa Worledge. And while Lisa gets herself ready and prepares her screen and things, I'll introduce her. Lisa is the head of conservation services for the Bat Conservation Trust. And she's been working there since 2011. She's the primary contact about bats and disease. She's going to give an overview of what we know about the bats and disease, focus on the disease that may be found here in the UK. So I see that Lisa, you're ready. So I'm going to hand over to you.
Great, thanks ever so much, Dave. In the short time we have, I'm not going to be able to go into huge detail on bats and diseases in the UK. So I'm going to focus on those areas that we get most questions about at the Bat Conservation Trust. And also I understand from the Bats and Churches project team that they get asked about regularly as well. So we're going to cover rabies, issues with droppings and urine, as Dave has mentioned, as well as the impact of diseases on bats themselves. So let's start with the only known zoonotic disease, that is to say a disease of animal origin that's harmful to humans, that's associated with bats here in the UK, rabies. Now, rabies is a rare but extremely serious infection of the brain and central nervous system. Worldwide, it's usually caught from the bite or scratch of an infected animal, most often a dog. We don't have that sort of classical rabies here. However, a small number of bats in the UK do carry rabies viruses called European bat lyssaviruses. These viruses are also transmitted via a bite or a scratch from an infected animal, or from its saliva coming into contact with your mucous membrane, so that's your eyes, your nose or mouth. Bats aren't normally aggressive and they'll avoid contact with humans. So this means there's no risk if you don't handle bats. How do we know and understand the prevalence of European bat lyssaviruses in the UK? Well, the main method is through the Animal and Plant Health Agency's ongoing passive surveillance programme. This was started back in 1987, and it relies on dead bats being submitted to the agency to be tested. They come from bat workers, people with bat roosts in their homes or their churches, and other people who may come across a dead bat. To date, over 19,000 bats have been submitted, of which 15,000 have been tested. The risk of catching bats from rabies in the UK is very low, but you don't have to take my word for it. This quote is from the gov.uk website under the Animal and Plant Health Agency pages on bats and rabies in the UK. And of course, there's a very simple way to protect yourself from this low risk, to make it no risk. Don't handle bats. If you do have to handle bats, then wear appropriate gloves. And Gail's going to demonstrate a bit later on how to contain a bat if you find a grounded or injured one. If you don't get bitten, scratched or nipped by a bat, there's no risk. But if that does happen, if you do get bitten, nipped or scratched, then wash the wound immediately with soap and water for at least 5 minutes. Additionally, cleanse the wound site with an alcohol base or other disinfectant. That's also recommended. And you should seek immediate medical advice, for example, from your GP or the NHS Direct helpline on 111. Rabies post-exposure vaccination is very effective when given promptly. Moving on, we get lots of questions about the risks from bat droppings and urine. Most commonly, bat droppings accumulate underneath a roost, below the points that bats use to access a building or their roost, like the image here, which is actually droppings, and I'm sad to say, a couple of dead bats from Holy Trinity Church in Tattershall, Lincolnshire. All of our native bat species feed on insects, so their droppings are made up of these dried insect remains, and bat droppings are very crumbly as a result. On extremely rare occasions, there are health risks associated with droppings, but these are from allergic reactions to the insect remains in bat poo, or from dust inhalation, for example, if cleaning up very large quantities of droppings. Rarely do we have the quantity of droppings in the image in the top right on the screens in front of you. This is cheating somewhat, as this is actually a picture from a bat roost in Europe. But there are also rare cases of gastrointestinal infection from consumption of droppings. But these risks are not bat specific. It's safe to say I wouldn't recommend the consumption of the poo of any animal. And these risks can be avoided by following simple precautions, such as wearing a dust mask when you're clearing droppings, maintaining basic standards of hygiene. And if we didn't before, we all certainly know how to wash our hands properly now, thanks to all of the advice we've been given during the current pandemic. One question I get asked regularly when talking about bats and diseases is whether histoplasmosis is a risk in the UK. Now, this is an infection caused by a fungus, and the fungus is shown in this photo micrograph. It's magnified over 800 times. Histoplasmosis is not associated with UK bats or their droppings. All reported cases in the UK have been associated with travel to other parts of the world where histoplasmosis or the histoplasma fungus is endemic. It's most common in North and Central America, in equatorial Africa, and parts of Asia and Australia as well. So the disease histoplasmosis is associated with bat droppings or guano in some of these areas, for example, in the USA. This is simply not the case here in the UK. The main concern with bat urine doesn't usually relate to human health, but the fact it contains high concentrations of uric acid, which can corrode metals such as organ pipes, etch polished surfaces such as doors and pews, stain light-coloured fabrics such as altar cloths, and damage porous stones such as marble and alabaster. I have been asked to mention leptospirosis, the most severe form of this disease being Weil's disease. There are no known cases of someone catching leptospirosis directly from a bat that I'm aware of, but Leptospira bacteria are diverse and widespread in many animals around the world. But the most effective way to avoid getting leptospirosis from any animal source is to prevent urine coming into contact with broken skin or your eyes, nose or mouth. So we're back to good hygiene and hand washing again. Many people have asked questions about how to safely clean where there are accumulations of dropping in urine within churches, and guidelines have been produced by the Bats in Churches project and are available on the project website. And this includes how to keep yourself safe, as well as how to protect the bats roosting in these wonderful buildings. Now, our focus when we talk about bats and diseases is often the human implications. And obviously that's one of the main reasons that we're having this session today. But it's really important that we understand this isn't all in one direction. Bats can be susceptible to emerging infectious diseases too. And an example of that is white nose syndrome in North America. This is a disease that actually has its origins in Europe and Asia. And it was spread to North America by humans. The first case was in 2006 in New York State. And by 2020, it had spread to 7 Canadian provinces and 35 USA states. A number of species are affected, and millions of bats have died as a result of white nose syndrome. To put this into context, the little brown bat was once one of the most common bats of northeastern United States and southeastern Canada, much like our common pipistrelle across the UK. But it's now listed as an endangered species in Canada and as sensitive or protected species as in several states of the USA. This is all due to the dramatic population declines resulting from white nose syndrome. The syndrome itself is a collection of symptoms, one of which is the presence of a white fungus that gives the disease its name. But others include mass mortality, bats clustered near the entrances of hibernacula, so winter roosting sites, or in areas not normally identified as such roosting sites. Bats flying outside in the daytime in temperatures at or below freezing, and dead or dying bats in or near hibernation sites. To date, this disease has only been found in North America, where, as I've mentioned, the fungus was introduced as a novel pathogen, most likely as a result of transfer on clothing or equipment of cave visitors travelling from Europe or Asia. So, is white nose syndrome present in Europe? The short answer is no, but we do have the fungus. There's been a paper or a couple of papers that have talked about the deaths of bats in the Czech Republic and Russia associated with the fungus that causes the syndrome. But we haven't had any cases of mass mortality in Europe. We've had no significant observations of bats behaving abnormally in or around hibernacula. And that's because we believe the fungus is highly likely to have evolved over a long association with European bat species, to the extent that some of the winter behaviour we observe in species today has its origins in ancient infections. And genetic studies have shown significantly greater diversity of strains of the fungus in Europe and Asia than in North America, also consistent with it originating here and having been present for a long time. Now, we've undertaken various projects over the last decade to understand the distribution of the fungus that causes the disease in North America, but that distribution of the fungus here in the UK. Working with the Animal and Plant Health Agency on a passive surveillance programme, much like the rabies one, reliant on submission of bats or samples from volunteers, but also with various academic partners and hibernation survey volunteers from the National Bat Monitoring Programme on active surveillance work. All of these images are from surveys to collect samples during hibernation visits, all under the appropriate licences, I hasten to add. As a result of these this work, we found the fungus at a number of sites in the south and eastern parts of England, and we've still never found any evidence of mass mortality. So the situation here is similar to the rest of Europe. We have the fungus, but not the disease. I just want to say a thank you to everyone who supports our work around disease surveillance in the UK, that submits their bats to the scheme that the Animal and Plant Health Agency run, to those people that help when we have these active surveillance programmes too. Very little of BCT's work around bats and diseases is funded, and we're grateful to the partners we work with in government and academia here and worldwide, especially to all of our wonderful volunteers who support us and follow best practice when it comes to working with bats. Finally, as you all know from what you see in the media so often, there's been much speculation about bats and diseases, especially viruses, and especially over the last year. And Tom will be talking about bats and coronaviruses next. But bats come in for a lot of bad press when it comes to disease. Recent research shows that bats don't actually host more disease-causing pathogens than any other members of any other groups of animals, mammals and birds of similar species diversity. It's worth remembering there are more than 1,400 species of bats worldwide, 18 here in the UK, the second largest group of mammals by species. So please don't blame bats. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Thank you very much indeed. And I know the Bat Conservation Trust are always happy to help, and they've got lots of information on their website. Hopefully you saw access to that on the slides there. As Tom starts to prepare himself, just to remind you about the Q&A, if you look at the bottom of the screen on mine, it might be slightly different if you're watching this live. You can put questions and our team will try and answer those as we go along, but also we can put them to the panel at the end of our webinar as well. Going to move on to our second speaker, Tom August, Dr. Tom August, and he's busy sharing his screen here. A bit more information about Tom. He works for the Centre of Ecology and Hydrology, which focuses on bridging the gap between research scientists and information technology experts. Tom, PhD, was on coronaviruses in bats. So I think he's been pretty busy recently giving some expertise, and we look forward to that today. He'll be able to share some of his insight into his findings about bats and coronaviruses. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Tom.
Thank you, David. As you said, I'm going to present today some findings from my PhD, and I should put my hands up and say some of these slides are 12 years old. That's when I was doing this research, and it's sort of with a bit of a heavy heart that I'm being invited to give these sorts of presentations, because obviously it's only because of the sort of global tragedy that we're in. But hopefully some of my insights from my time during my PhD, although 12 to 10 years ago, will help to give you some understanding about coronaviruses more generally and the situation in the UK. So this slide is taken straight from a presentation that I gave back in 2008. And this was giving the rationale behind why I thought my PhD was interesting at that time. And Lisa's already talked about how bats are found to be the reservoir of some diseases, so that was interesting. And what had happened a few years earlier in 2002, 2003, some of you might remember, was the SARS outbreak, SARS epidemic. And this has killed quite a lot of people by the standards of the time, obviously completely overshadowed by the current global tragedy. And at that time, we knew that SARS was a coronavirus, and we thought that perhaps it had its ancestral origins in bats, but we really didn't know much about bats and coronaviruses globally. And so there was a big research effort by people all over the world to try and better understand what coronaviruses were present in bats and at what prevalence and where, and how that varied seasonally. So that's what my PhD was essentially trying to look at. So this is a figure which is probably very familiar to you, of a coronavirus spreading from Southeast Asia, traveling through our international travel networks by plane all over the world. But this is not COVID-19. This is the original SARS outbreak in 2002, 2003. You can see a lot of striking similarities, and we wanted to make sure we could learn as much from this as possible to try and prevent and mitigate a similar event happening in the future. And obviously we weren't as successful as we'd hoped we would have been. I want to very briefly touch on why coronaviruses are particularly interesting as a group of viruses in terms of their ability to jump from wildlife animals or from animals to humans. That's called a zoonotic disease. And just very briefly, something that viruses all do, I've represented a virus by a sort of hexagonal thing, and it's got its genetic material inside it, and it's invading this cell in the middle, and then it replicates. And now we've got more viruses coming out of that cell. That could be a human cell. One of the things viruses do is they mutate. So one of the viruses that's coming out of this cell has a slight difference to it, that little blue segment. And that might give it an improved ability to infect another individual of the same species, another human perhaps, or it might make it worse. But these mutations allow it to sort of iteratively improve through evolution. Another thing that coronaviruses can do is something called recombination. And influenza viruses can do this as well, where you might have two different coronaviruses infect the same cell, and then they swap a big portion of their genetic material. So you see the bottom virus here that came out has now got half green, half red. This allows them to evolve very quickly and in quite big jumps. And so that's what makes coronaviruses and some other families of viruses particularly good at adapting. And that's why you hear about things like the South African variant of the new thing. And that's what they're talking about, this sort of rapid evolution. They're also RNA viruses. It's just the type of genetic material they contain that sort of aids in their rapid mutation. It also means that they're a little bit less stable when they're out in the open air. They don't survive for as long compared to DNA, which is obviously what our genetic material is made up of. So to try and understand more about the coronaviruses in British bats, I studied a population or a few different populations of bats in Wytham Wood. So Wytham Wood is a beautiful woodland outside of Oxford, and it's used by Oxford University for doing a lot of environmental studies. One of the big studies they have there is a 60-year study of the bird populations. So they've got, in this map, all these black dots are bird boxes for blue tits and grey tits. So it's like 1,100 of these boxes, bananas, they're all over the place. And when the birds stop using them, when the juveniles fledge, the bats in the woods start to use them. And that gives us unprecedented access to the bat population. So I went round and collected poo from bats for 3 years. I mean, what a wonderful experience. And from that, we were able to extract the RNA of any viruses present and try and see if we could find any evidence of coronaviruses there. So here's a brief table of results. What you see here in the top 3 rows, we had some bats that had coronavirus. So Natterer's bats and Dorbenton's bats, they both had coronaviruses and at fairly high prevalences too, around about 50%. We found no evidence that the fact that they had the virus made them sick. Okay, they weren't underweight or anything like that. There's no evidence that made them sick. And then the rest of the rows here are other species we looked at, but we didn't find any coronaviruses. Admittedly, some of the sample sizes are quite small, so we only looked at one Barber-style bat, for example. So bats in the UK did have coronaviruses, and that was a new finding. What I want to show you here is a family tree of those viruses that we found. So just as you would expect to see a family tree of sort of how you're related to your relatives, this is showing you how different viruses are related to each other. So if you look at these top 2 here, they sit right next to each other in the family tree, which means these 2 viruses are closely related to each other. Whereas one at the top and the one at the very bottom, you have to go a long way through this tree to get them, so they're distantly related to each other. This is a family tree of some of the coronaviruses. Down here where the red arrow is, this is where the virus that causes COVID-19 sits in here, as well as this one with a black dot next to it. This is the one that created that SARS outbreak that I was interested in back in 2002, 2003. These other black dotted ones are other human coronaviruses which cause the common cold. So the viruses I found here all in bold, and the sort of take-home message is that the viruses, they group together depending on the species of bat. So one species of bat has its own little form of coronaviruses. And then additionally, in these Natterer's bats, you might see there's a slight difference in the name of these viruses, and they group in 2 different groups here. So these are from 2 different locations in the UK, only about 15 kilometers apart. And this is interesting to us that even over a short distance, these viruses had evolved a little bit differently so that we could tell them apart. Important to note that these viruses are not closely related to any of the human coronaviruses that exist. Talk a little about seasonality. So I was interested in what time of year did bats have the most coronavirus. Now, we know that humans often get a lot of flu over winter. And we think that's because we sort of all come inside and start mixing around a bit more and we get more transmission. The pattern we see here, there's a peak you'll see in males. This is Dorbenton's bats, males post-nursery. So males during the nursery period, they tend to stay away from the females and juveniles. They kind of isolate themselves. But post-nursery, they do a lot of mixing. And so the theory is that just as we, by socially distancing, avoiding contact with other people, reduce transmission of coronavirus, and therefore reduce the prevalence in our populations, male Dorbentons, by staying isolated during the nursery season, reduce their prevalence of coronavirus. So this is quite exciting, and I hadn't really realized the sort of how nice the result was. So I revisited my PhD after people were more interested after COVID-19 and thought, oh, actually, yeah, maybe we're seeing here an evidence of social distancing in nature that's evolved. So nature got there first, as is often the case. I want to talk a little bit about what the potential risk of spillover in the UK is. So we know that there's been the spillover of coronaviruses in the Far East that's led to COVID-19. We don't know necessarily which animal that came from. And now I'm saying that there's coronaviruses in the UK. So does that mean there's a risk here too? Well, the first thing to say is that just because you buy a lottery ticket doesn't mean you're going to win the lottery. So we have coronaviruses in bats in the UK, but what we would need for that to emerge was the sorts of environments that allow lots of mixing between bats and other animals and humans, that would give plenty of opportunity for these viruses to evolve in just the right way that when they jump, they could then survive. And that's really quite unlikely in the UK context. When you compare it to the sorts of environments that exist in the Far East, where you have markets with crowded conditions, with wild animals in cages that are being sold and traded, those sorts of environments do offer those sorts of opportunities. So the risk in the UK is really very low. And so just to pick up a little bit more on that last point, is that there is a connectedness between the health of humans, the health of the environment, and the health of wildlife that is really important to understanding these spillover events and resulting pandemics. Environments where wild animals are under stress is going to make suppress their immune system, make them more susceptible to infection. If we have them in crowded conditions, it increases transmission. And if we have them in crowded conditions with other animals, it increases the ability for diseases to jump from one to another. So creating healthy habitats, healthy environments where wild animals can exist as they do naturally, reduces the chance that they have high levels of disease and reduces the chance that these diseases might spill over to humans. So there's really a very strong link between looking after the welfare and the health of animals and the environment, and that benefiting us directly through benefits to our own health. And this is called the One Health concept. So I'm going to finish there and happy to take any questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you indeed. Wonderful and excellent, and give us a good insight there, and that link, or lack of link maybe, between COVID-19 and bats there. Questions are coming in the Q&A. Please do continue to do that. I saw 1 or 2 questions coming in. I say the team will try and answer those as we go along, but also we'll try and get to some of them at the end of our time together. Going to move on to our third speaker, Gail Armstrong. She's going to give Gail a chance to get herself ready and her screen ready. Just a little bit of sort of a background. Gail's going to give us some practical hygiene advice when it comes to bats. She works tirelessly as a bat carer, taking in and rehabilitating injured or sick bats and releasing them back into the wild. And I know we're going to see some live bats today. Doing this, she comes into that close contact with the bats, these animals, and some of the way that she may show us in the next few minutes how we can handle those and her experience. So Gail, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, my name's Gail, and I got into bat care by accident about 25 years ago. And I've probably looked after I know I've looked after well over 1,000 bats over that period of time. And even go so far as to hand raise pups that are found without their mums and get those released. I even have a flight cage, like an aviary, in my garden where the pups learn to fly before they're released. So there's some stuff I have to bear in mind when I do that that's legal. The Abandonment of Animals Act from the 60s, having taken a bat into my care, I can't then release it back to the wild if I know it can't fend for itself. And there's also recent, feels like recent, 2006, the Animal Welfare Act, which confers on me, it confers on us all actually, a duty of care for animals that we look after. And animals I look after must have the freedoms specified in the Act, and they include to be kept in a suitable environment, fed a suitable diet, allowed to exhibit their normal behaviours, housed appropriately, and protected from pain, injury, suffering, or disease. Now, it is illegal to have bats in captivity, and it's illegal to harm or kill a bat, but there are two exceptions that relate to bat care. So, number one, if you have the bat in care because you're tending it with a view to making it fit enough to be released, that's one exception. And the second one is we can do mercy killing if the bat is so injured that there is no reasonable hope of recovery. So just some statistics for you, some facts and figures. We get a lot more males in for care than females, and especially juvenile bats, massively more males than females. And that's because male bats have to be the adventurous ones. They have to be the risk takers and the ones that leave their natal colony and move out into the world. About 60% of the bats that come in for care are released quite quickly. And I looked at some figures yesterday, and nearly 3/4 of the bats that come in to care arrive between June and August. So that's the key time. And we know that that's the time when bats have got their pups and they're breeding and they're very active. So that's, yeah. Now, in almost 60% of cases, I think it was about 58% when I looked, there's nothing wrong with the bat, except they've made a mistake. Or they're inexperienced. So they may have got into a building and can't find their way out and hide away for some time before they're found. And by the time they're found, they're weak and dehydrated. They may have got grounded through inexperience. So when a bat has to learn to fly and learn the maneuvers. So when it first starts to fly, it might bank a bit too steeply and stall and crash down. Or it might get caught out in poor weather because it's just started to fly and it doesn't know about wind or rain. Or it might just be hungry because we've had a spell of poor weather and it can't find enough insects. So that's 6 out of 10 bats there's not really much wrong with, other than they just need a little bit of help. Another 3 out of 10, 30% of bats that come in have had an encounter with a domestic cat. Now, some of those might be the same thing. The bat might have been found on the ground and the cat just picks it up and takes it home. But cats that are allowed to hunt all night do an awful lot of damage to our bats that forage over our gardens. And a cat will sit quietly and wait and watch, maybe for hours on end. And don't forget, the cat has to be lucky with one swipe. The bat's got to be lucky every night of its life, and the cat just has to be lucky once. And cats break bones, they cause blunt force trauma, and they tear the wing membranes. So that's 90% of our bats. The other 10% have something else wrong. They might be injured or they might be ill. And I did look at my records yesterday when I was coming here today, and I noticed that what I classified as an ill bat, which means there's something wrong with it and it doesn't get better, but it's not an injury, that amounts to 11. So I've had 11 sick bats over 25 years. So illness is not really a common reason for bats coming into care. But despite all of that, hygiene and safety precautions are very important. We always wear gloves when we're handling bats, and that's always been because of the rabies risk, but now it has more importance. We now, for the past year, we wear a face mask when we're getting up close and personal with any bat. And that's because we just don't know whether there is a risk to our bats from the SARS-CoV-2. Can we give it back to our bats? And we don't know. And there's no evidence yet that this is a simple precautionary measure that we wear a mask when we're doing our bat care. Now, simple cleaning of equipment and cages is not onerous. We use normal detergents, mild disinfectants most of the time. Disposable of paper that lines the cages, paper towels, any other detritus, just goes in the normal household waste. So we don't have to take any special precautions with that kind of thing. So for members of the public finding bats, and that includes on the ground or inside the church, what should you do? Well, any bat on the ground is vulnerable. So it's usually best to ensure at least that it's not going to get stepped on. The Bat Conservation Trust has a really good section on how to contain a bat without having to handle it. And if you regularly come across bats on the ground in your church, it's an idea to keep a bat containing kit handy. So I've got this one. This is just a plastic box with a towel inside, a pair of gloves that you would put on, and maybe a tea towel, or a piece of card which you would drop over the bat and scoop it up, or alternatively you can have a piece of cardboard and shuffle the bat into your box and put the lid on. We know, but if you look on the Bat Conservation Trust website, that's all there. Once the bat is contained, there is a national bat helpline number. I think that that's going to be put up on the board, and you should be able to find someone like me who is local to where you are. The helpline operates in office hours all year, but in the summer, volunteers take the calls up to 10 p.m. at night and all weekend. So that's amazing that you can ring up, speak to someone, get the number of a local bat carer in the height of summer. If you can't get through on the national number, there are on the BCT website some regional helplines, and you might find one near to you. And as a last resort, you can take the bat to a vet. And most of the local bat carers do build up relationships with vets, so the vet hopefully the bat will get the help it needs. So the last thing to bear in mind is just bear in mind that most bats found on the ground haven't got much wrong with them. And if they can get a helping human hand, they might get on their way and live a long and productive life. So what I'm going to do now, I've got a little bat to show you. Putting on my gloves, I've got to put my mask on, and I'm going to change my camera over to a small camera, but I'm putting my mask up first. And I switch over to that, and then there will be a slight delay while I get a bat out. So this is a Leisler's bat. Can you still hear me? Yeah. This is a Leisler's bat that came in for care, was found lying in the snow on a cold February morning, and he had an injured wrist area, and he never has flown very well. Leisler's bats are quite a rare bat. They, in my part of the world anyway, in fact, they're so rare that this is him, the only one that's ever been found in my part of the world. And it's possible that he did come from elsewhere, because I live on Morecambe Bay and this bat is common on the Isle of Man. So maybe he took a ride on a ferry, who knows. He's a very calm little bat in captivity, and he does a lot of good as an ambassador. I'll just show you his wing, because when a bat is folded up, I know they do look a bit smaller than you're used to seeing. But if we just unfold the wing gently, you will see how much bigger he would be when he was flying. Do you want me to go on with another one? Yeah, I'm going to do it.
Yeah, what? Yeah, another
Yeah,
one, Gail, that's fine, thank you.
So our poster boy of British bats is this one, the long-eared bat. So that's on most of the pictures. It's certainly on the Bats in Churches logo. And this little fella's just come to live with me because his carer is having family problems. So he's a very weak little bat. We don't really know why. He doesn't fly very well, but he tries to take off like a little helicopter and just ends up back on the ground. And the long-eared bat is very much a woodland species. So they've got quite a broad wing when we look at the wing, because they're a slow flying bat. They are normally flying in woodland, catching moths. Sorry for the delay. I have got everything to hand, but it always takes longer. So this is our most common bat. This is a little pipistrelle. And this little one was found on the ground in the snow a few days ago. I think she'd just fallen out from under someone's soffit board. And she's a little bit underweight. She weighed 3.5 grams when she came in, which just shows you how amazing these little animals are. 3.5 grams is not even as much as a pound coin. And this little one is now eating really well. In captivity, we feed our bats on mealworms, and she's eating really well, and she will be released in due course when it warms up a bit, I think. So I hope that's given you an insight into what bat care is all about, and I'll now hand back for questions.
Thank you very much, Gail. It's wonderful to see some of these amazing mammals, and thank you for all that you do in caring and rehabilitating bats as well. It's wonderful to hear about that, and that's helped us, for those of us who may encounter bats. And what we need is a person like Gail nearby that we can pass them on to look after them so well. So thank you, Gail. We've had a number of questions coming in on the Q&A. There's still time to do that. We'll try and get to as many of those as we can. And I know that our team here have been answering some of your questions. We did have some questions that came in from churches and from other people before the webinar. So we'll start with those, and then when there's time, we'll try and get to some of the ones you put in the Q&A, but hopefully you've seen that some of those have been answered. We have our panel of experts. So we've got Lisa, Tom and Gail to help us. So the first question that came in is, can we give bats COVID-19 or pass any diseases onto them? I think, Lisa, you touched on that, about the sort of two-way communication of diseases. So can we give bats COVID-19 or pass any diseases onto them? I don't know whether Lisa wants to answer that one.
I can make a start, and then perhaps I'll pass over to Tom for the coronavirus specific ones. With white nose syndrome, what we were doing was transmitting the pathogen in the environment. So the fungus that causes the disease is found in soils, in caves, for example. So there it was people travelling internationally, not cleaning equipment or clothing that had been in cave sites. So we took what was a long established pathogen here in Europe and we transmitted it to another part of the world. And we've seen that happen not just with bats, but with a host of other examples, particularly around funguses, actually. But I'm going to let Tom, are you happy to respond to the question in relation
the
to
COVID specific question, Tom, about whether we can we can give bats COVID-19 or other diseases?
So I guess something to establish straight away is that it's very unlikely that the virus that we have now came directly from bats. So that there's quite a distance between it. We think that the virus that causes COVID-19 back in its ancestry may well have come from bats, but there's been a lot of change between that, and it might have come through different intermediate hosts, different types of animals before it came to us. And so because there's probably quite a lot of distance between, and difference therefore, between the viruses that they have and the virus that we have now, it seems unlikely that occur, but it's not out of the realm of possibilities. And so as a consequence, that's why Gail talked about wearing protective gloves and masks when she's handling bats, to just be really on the safe side. It is worth saying that humans can transmit COVID-19 to other animals. So there's been instances of cats getting the virus that causes COVID-19. And there's some evidence of some transmission between humans and mink as well, but no evidence of humans transmitting COVID-19, the virus that causes COVID-19, to bats.
Thank you very much. Let's move on. This is a question about cleaning products, and so I don't know who would be the best one to answer this one. What might be safe to use for COVID that protects the heritage and also the bats themselves in terms of cleaning? I don't know who would want to address that one.
I'm happy to chip in here, only to point people at the really excellent guidance on the Bats and Churches website. I mentioned it in my talk, but if you go to the Bats and Churches website, under the resources section, there is, it was written with sort of post-lockdown cleaning in mind for churches that had been closed for a while, but the guidance in there is still relevant, and that does cover both keeping the bats safe and the humans safe. The main thing is, some people have talked about kind of fumigating churches to sort of go, you don't want to be doing that in buildings that you've got bats also roosting in. You want more targeted cleaning, but that Bats and Churches guidance is excellent, so I direct people there.
Thank you very much. And there are lots of resources on the website, so please do use that website. Moving on, third question here. Are bats a reservoir of lots of diseases, more so than other mammals? Are bats a reservoir for lots of diseases, more so than other mammals?
So I'm sure Tom might well want a chip in here as well, but it's really interesting because this comes back quite regularly. There's been relatively recent work done by the University of Glasgow, and they determined that actually that wasn't the case, that bats didn't host more pathogens than other animal groups, that the explanation, if you like, related to the diversity of bats. And if you compare them with similarly diverse groups, and I'm going to mention rodents here, rodents are the largest group of mammals by species, bats are the second largest. They weren't actually hosting any more pathogens than other groups, but they do get a lot of attention, it has to be said. But yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. If Tom wants to add anything to that.
Do you want to add anything in there, Tom?
No, I think that was a good answer. Thanks, Lisa.
Excellent. Okay, this is a question about whether we're monitoring the level of sort of incidence of coronavirus in UK bats. I know you did your research, Tom, and you found some evidence, although your helpful family tree showed where it was in the sort of a range of viruses in the similar area. I mean, is that being actively monitored at the moment? Do you know?
So it's not, so it hasn't been since I did my PhD. I mean, no doubt that there will be a renewed interest, just as that, my PhD originated from that original SARS outbreak. I'm sure there will be renewed interest in coronaviruses. And I have had conversations with researchers who are interested in doing some surveillance, more surveillance in the UK to try and understand what coronaviruses are out there. I guess personally, I would question whether that's the right question to be asking. I think we need to be focusing our attention on what the environments that facilitate those sort of spillover events, and knowing everything that's out there doesn't actually help you. It's about understanding the situations that result in that emergence. And so for me, it's more about understanding these sorts of environments in Southeast Asia and that might exist elsewhere in the world, but really facilitate these spillover events. I think that's where we need to be looking.
And those type of environments, I mean, you touched on that. Just did want to emphasize what those sort of environments are.
Yeah, so people might, so people might have, quite early on, people were talking about wet markets, which perhaps isn't the right term to be used, but there's a lot of animal markets where there's the trade and in trade and selling of live animals, and quite often they're wild animals in cages and they're sold for meat, and they're unclean, unsanitary environments, and that close proximity and the unsanitary nature gives plenty of opportunity for viruses to jump from one host to another. And then because we as humans then have close contact with those animals, whether you're a butcher or a restaurant worker or someone who works in the market, because you then have lots of contact with those animals, you can then get infected. And that's a very common route for these zoonotic diseases, so diseases that come from wildlife, is that the wildlife reservoir, perhaps a bat, will infect a peri-domestic animal, an animal that humans live with, cattle, for example, or animals in these markets. And it's in those animals and these intermediate hosts that the virus then replicates, and that then infects humans. And as I said earlier, we don't really have these sorts of environments in the UK.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much. This is a big question which needs a short answer, which is probably going to be quite hard. What makes a disease species specific or not? And that's quite a big question. Is there a short answer? What makes a disease species specific or not?
So it's not my area of expertise really, but each species has a different immune system, and their biology works in a slightly different way. And so if you're let's talk about viruses. If you're a virus trying to get into a human cell, you need to have the right key to get in, and that key is going to be different depending if it's human or a chimpanzee or a gorilla, or different bat species. The evolution I talked about through mutation and recombination, where you're switching, that enables them to adjust their keys, which might give them access. So it's these different defenses result in the requirement for viruses to evolve into different species of virus to be able to get into the different organisms.
Thank you for trying to simplify it for those of us who aren't the scientists amongst us. Thank you very much, Tom. That really helps. The bats are demonized. We know that, and sadly we've had touched on that today. Dogs kill more people than bats do. Why isn't that put more in the context for the general public, do we feel? Why do bats have this reputation? Does anyone want to sort of address that?
We can blame Bram Stoker, I suppose. But, people naturally are a little worried by something that they can't see clearly, I think, that manages quite well in the dark. But also, the stories of vampires do generate that fear as well. And I think it's just a bit unfortunate.
Okay. Anything for the Bat Conservation Trust, Lisa, that you feel you want to stand up for bats here?
Well, first of all, they're amazing, so I don't know how anyone can not love them, but obviously I'm somewhat biased there. I think it doesn't help when people only read the headlines, when people and things are taken out of context. As Gail says, that there's always something of the other about bats, but I think it's a case of people just spending a little bit more time, look beneath the headline, look at information. We've got plenty on our website. There's plenty out there from other organisations as well. Don't just take what someone has done and turned into a short sentence, often not the person who's written the article. You know, go dig a little bit deeper, and then you'll find out just how amazing these animals really are. And it's also important, bats are demonised, but bats also are telling us really important things about health. So, for example, there's an anticoagulant that's been developed from vampire bat saliva. Bats are teaching us about things that relate to our own immune systems, to longevity, to how we could fight off cancer. There's lots of ways that bats are actually really helping human health and our research into them. So yeah, do a little bit of digging, look around, and hopefully you'll come to love them as much as we do. And they're just awesome.
Thank you. That sort of touches on the next question that we've been asked. Is it true that bats have great immune systems? Does this make them a viral reservoir for disease spillover? Do they have a great immune system? Does this make them a viral reservoir for disease spillover?
So there's been a lot of work into this question around whether bats are special or not in terms of their immune system. And there's a lot of research going on. It's immune systems for humans as well, the big research areas. So understanding the immune systems of bats are really important. Bearing in mind, we keep on talking bats, but there are over 1,400 species, so their immune systems do vary. There are elements of bats' life cycles that do make them special. The fact they hibernate, the fact they fly, and it's believed that it's this power of flight that is particularly significant to the strength of their immune systems because of the temperature that their bodies are operating at. Now, I think the team will share in the link, there's a little short video by an organisation called Minute Earth. It's on YouTube, it's a cutting one, but it sort of explains about what might be special about bat immune systems. And way we think they're special is that they do seem to be able to cope with certain pathogens and not get sick. So that doesn't mean they never get sick. Bats do get sick, not just from cat attacks, but for other things too. So, but we see not necessarily the same sort of response in terms of disease to infections with certain viruses for bats than we would see with those same viruses. And quite often that's probably more because they've evolved in long association with bats, but it might also be down to their immune system. Again, it's another reason why bats are awesome, because there's so much to learn.
And the last of the sort of the pre-questions that we got, and I think Tom, you touched on this. Is there a seasonality in disease found in bats? And there was a little bit in your research about the different sort of times of the cycle, if you like, of the disease. Do you just want to touch on that again?
Yeah, so my work seemed to suggest that there is seasonality, and that's related to the density of the population, how often they're coming into contact with each other. And that we know that makes sense. And everything we've learned this year from the government public health announcements about what we should and shouldn't be doing, that coming together in big groups is going to result in diseases being spread around. So it's really no surprise that we see that seasonality in bats, because bats do have very different behaviors in different times of the year. In the winter, they go into hibernation, and there's much less interaction going on. So it makes sense that there's that seasonality.
Thank you very much. Now I'm conscious we're coming towards the end of our time, so lots of questions being put in the Q&A. I'm sorry that we haven't been able to address all those. One person asked about where the access is for these talk, if they want to show them to someone else or encourage others to watch them. They will be on the website, so that you access to get here to in the first place. So they are being recorded, so you can show them again. There was a question there, I think, about have bats put people off going to church? Well, I think I'm probably the one to answer that one. I would say, sadly, yes. If I'm really honest, there is a situation where if a church, some of the churches I have responsibility for have actually been closed because of the bat infestation and the droppings and the urine and some of the other issues that we commented on. And so it has, to some extent, put people off. And I think the fears, and some of those fears, and incorrect fears about the link between viruses, coronavirus in particular, have put some people off. Hopefully we can dispel some of those misunderstandings, and that fake news, which is a phrase we use at the moment. But yes, I would sadly say there has been a situation where people have been put off going to church because of bats, and churches have been closed for several months. And that's where the Bat Project has been really helpful in terms of how we live together, how we have these incredible animals that we've seen today, and they're unique in so many ways. And thank you to Gail for showing us some of those live bats, and thank you to Tom and Lisa to help dispel some of the misunderstandings around disease. It's important that we get that news out, because we can live together, we can have bats, and we need to conserve them because they are unique animals, and we can still use our churches for worship as well, and for ministry, which is what they're there for, obviously. Thank you for joining the webinar today. Just want to make sure that we've covered everything. There will be at the end a short sort of feedback survey that if you're able to do, that will pop up as we finish today. So if you're able to respond, please do, or maybe come back to it, but best to do it immediately if you can. That's always very helpful. Thank you again, particularly to Lisa, to Gail, to Tom for your expertise and your input. It is very much appreciated. And thank you to the Bats in Churches project for putting this on today, but also all the work that they're doing to try and help us understand bats better and help us in the church community to live alongside these unique animals. Please be able to join us. Thank you very much. Thank you to our experts, and enjoy the rest of your day.